Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, when aid doesn't work. It is an industry in itself, giving money to those in need. But whether we're talking the countries giving or the ones receiving, has it all turned into a big waste of time? And not just the money, is the mechanism broken, the ways in which we raise money and the reasons. Hello everyone, that is our discussion this week, a special look at the aid industry and whether international aid programs are part of the solution to global poverty or if they actually exacerbate the problem. Because we all know the allegations about aid not getting through to those who need it, mostly because of things like corruption. But when it does get through, does foreign aid actually crowd out things like entrepreneurship, self-reliance, the things that will mean recipients need less money in the future? To start us off this week, the numbers. And we're going back to the past 50 years here, in which $2.3 trillion was spent on global aid. And in that time, if we focus in a bit further, $1 trillion of that just went to the African continent. Yet between 1980 and 2000, GDP in sub-Saharan Africa actually fell by 50%. All that money going in and growth going down. By the end of the 1980s, emerging market debt, that was at least $1 trillion, but the cost of servicing that debt was enormous. It dwarfed foreign aid, meaning that $15 billion was actually flowing out of poor countries between 1987 and 1989. And African countries still pay close to $20 billion in repayments every year. And here's a couple more really specific cases. Kenya, first of all, where the World Food Programme actually says that you've got $3 billion worth of food exports every year going out, and yet $300 million worth of food aid coming in. This was in 2010. And for many years, the West Bank and Gaza, well, they received the highest aid per capita worldwide, and yet the World Bank's 2012 growth report on the occupied Palestinian territories concluded that aid-driven growth was not sustainable. So this all goes back to a word we used earlier, the mechanism, the aid models, if you like, because aid money is a good idea, and those countries that have the cash are in a good position to do something positive for those without. The question is over it making a long-term difference so that the money spent in times of need will actually equate to less money being spent in the future because the recipient is actually making some progress. So those are our discussion points, and here are our guests to discuss it. In London, first of all, Alan Duncan. He is Minister of State at the UK Department for International Development. It is known as DFID. Over to Jerusalem, and Dr. Noura Murad, co-founder of the Dahlia Association, which promotes Palestinian self-sufficiency. And also in Nairobi, over Skype, is Will Ruddock. He is an associate scholar at the Institute for Leadership and Sustainability at the University of Cumbria, and we thank you all for joining us. What I would like to do at the start is ask one question to all three of you, just to get an idea of where you're all coming from. So let's start with Alan Duncan, and the question is, quite simply, is the aid model, which we have described in this program, possibly fundamentally flawed? It helps short-term, but maybe over the long term it doesn't do what it's supposed to.
No, it's not flawed, and the justification for what we do is contained in what we call ourselves. We're the Department for Development, not the Department for Aid. And the whole point of development is that you try and build the foundations in a country for them to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. That's what we do, and there are many examples where countries are now living without any kind of external assistance.
Okay, and I'm going to get your views later on exactly how effective that's been. Let's go to Noura Murad in Jerusalem for her views. How effective is it?
The international aid in Palestine is fundamentally flawed, and I would argue that because Palestinians are among the largest and longest recipients of international aid, and yet we still have the largest and longest refugee population in the world. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza don't have control over their borders, water, land, or other natural resources, and even the human resources in Palestine are dispersed because of Israeli policies. I really don't think that there has been sufficient progress to justify the amount of aid.
Okay, and of course Palestine is a very specific issue, and again we're going to discuss that later. Will Ruddock in Nairobi, your thoughts?
Well, if we're talking about development, we've really got to say what we mean by development and where we're going. Developed, quote-unquote, developed countries right now are having a lot of trouble justifying their own direction. I mean, we've got austerity coming into Greece. We've got over $45 trillion of debt in the world. The direction we're going as an entire planet is really, really called into question right now. And so the current directions of development really, really need to be rethought. In Kenya right now, we've got what many development experts would say is a good situation. We're exporting $3 billion of food to Europe. We're feeding Europeans in Kenya right now, while at the same time, Nora is absolutely right. We're in Kenya, we've been receiving food aid for the last almost 12 years. Every year, we have 1 million people starving to death and needing food aid from DFID and USAID and other groups. But at the same time, we're exporting billions of dollars worth of food to other countries. There's something fundamentally wrong with the development equation.
Okay, well, I think we best go back to Alan Duncan, who was talking about how well things work. You've heard there two very specific examples, and as I pointed out as well, you know, Palestine is very, very specific because it has all sorts of political implications as well. But essentially what Nora was saying is that they're getting lots of money. They have been getting lots of money for a long time in Palestine, but it hasn't made a difference, and it's really just an existence rather than real growth, real change.
Well, I think the point about Palestine is exactly the point you have just made, which is that the political circumstances around it are unique and they are part of a bigger regional problem. What we are doing is underpinning the Palestinian Authority in particular in order to equip the authority to be a future government. So if there's a two-state solution, they'll be in a position to govern a newly formed state. So in that sense, the development is working in those unique circumstances. In the case of Kenya, it's very peculiar perhaps that there are two economies, one where there is foreign investment, where they are growing food and exporting it, but there is another problem, which is the main problem of the country, which is underdeveloped internal markets and underdeveloped markets within Africa. And one of the things we do, which does make a difference, is underpin the basic building blocks of an agricultural economy and try and make sure that there can be properly working trade routes within and between countries. And that, when development works, is very effective over the long term.
Okay, so you've talked about two countries that you give money to. You are from government. I want to put this idea to you, and it's actually, go with me on this one. One of our correspondents, Tarek Bazley, was recently in Rome, and he actually spoke to Italy's finance minister and asked him, as an example, while Italy was in recession, was this actually the right time to continue helping other people in other countries? Just have a listen to what he said.
You've said these are hard times and the crisis is not over yet. Is it really the time in the economic cycle when Italy should be helping the world's poorest farmers?
Well, as I said, it's a very difficult time, but that's something that we have to do. And I think growth in the world is part of the Italian commitment. We know that we cannot grow alone. We have to grow with the rest of the world.
So, Mr. Duncan, he says, the Italian finance minister says, it's something we have to do. The world has to grow, and he's quite right. Is it a hard sell, though? Tell me what it's like in the UK. Is it a hard sell to keep pumping money overseas when there is recession at home, and that recession hasn't gone away, and there's still so many people unemployed and so many problems at home?
Well, we're the first major country in the world to commit to spend 0.7% of our gross national income on international development, and we will start that from later this year. Well, what good development needs is continuity, so we've related it to the size of our economy, but to some extent, when any national economy is facing difficulty, of course, politically, it's a challenge to convince people, but, you know, it's just over 1% of government spending, and when people complain, when you then talk to them and say, look, if you're down to your last £100 or $100, would you give one to someone who's dying in the street? And they say, yes, we probably would. And when you explain that that is really what we're doing as a government in the world, they say, oh, well, OK, get on with it, make sure you spend the money well. And so we spend a lot of time making sure we get value for money and focus on poverty and the things that really yield lasting results.
OK, let's get down to some specifics. We've already discussed Palestine a little bit, so we'll stay with that just for now. Actually, I want to take a look at some of the money spent in the occupied Palestinian territories. First, the DFID numbers, DFID being where Mr. Duncan is from. Over the 4 years to 2015, DFID plans to spend $545 million to support the Palestinian people. And then away from that, total foreign aid between 1993 and 2004 was $9 billion. But with all that aid, the World Bank said in 2009, nearly 22% of Palestinians were at the national poverty line. So, Will Ruddock in Nairobi, you hear all those numbers there, and it just points to a not very effective system. And as Mr. Duncan's pointed out rightly, it is a very particular political situation there, but it just gets that feeling of throwing good money after bad.
Well, I believe the political situation here is very similar throughout East Africa, in fact, the whole of Africa and many developing countries. But the key issue that we're really looking at the Institute is what are some new models? I mean, our current economic models in Europe, in the US, are crashing all around us. And those are what are informing our models for development in other nations. And we simply can't use those. What we've been looking at are models that are being used in countries like Switzerland. They have a bank there called the Swiss Weir Bank, which has about 60,000 businesses as part of a network that self-support each other through what's called a complementary currency. And so we're looking at taking those programs and those types of monetary innovations and trying to come up with new ways to look at development. And so for the last 4 years, we've been trying to develop pilot projects throughout Kenya to develop local currency systems that actually promote business incubation and promote local agriculture and local business to flourish without having to go directly into these loaning, microfinance, entrepreneurial models, which by and large are actually creating more social stratification. They're not producing less stratification, they're actually producing more of it, which is what we see throughout the entire world. The entire global banking system right now, the way it's producing an exponential rise in debt in the world right now is completely insatiable, and it's creating a huge amount of problems. So we need to get away from traditional development models and move into things that are creating more networks, more communities. And DFID is doing some of these programs like Alan mentioned, but we need a lot more in this direction. And all that money that's being spent right now in places like Kenya is really giving local governments the excuse of basically not doing their job. Here in Kenya, we just had our first presidential debates, and the president the Prime Minister on public television is telling us that on one side, there's corporations that are stopping his ability to develop because they have interest in insurance, they have interest in farming. And then on the other side, we have aid industry, which is
okay, Nora, let me...
They can't do anything. So we have sort of like a straitjacket situation going on.
Right, let's bring Nora back into the conversation. Sorry to interrupt you there. Well, let's bring Nora back into the conversation. Again, we've drilled back down into what's happening in Palestine there. Tell me, I mean, you've already illustrated the problems and how you feel the money's not working. Tell me how you'd like to see the money actually working. If it came down on the ground there, Alan's already pointed out that the money goes to supporting the Palestinian Authority. How would you rather see the money actually put to work on the ground in the West Bank?
Well, I think there's a very important role for international actors to play in Palestine and to support Palestinian development, but it's not by putting money through the current aid system, because while Alan Duncan said the idea of aid in Palestine is to support the Palestinian Authority so that when there is a two-state solution, the institutions will be in place, it's my analysis, and a lot of people agree with me, that there never will be a solution, and it's because of the aid, or one major reason is because of the aid and the way that it's being distributed. And so one thing that people don't understand well is that under international humanitarian law, Israel is obligated to care and protect the well-being of the occupied population, who are the Palestinians. And that means that they should be building schools and clinics and roads so that, you know, people can live properly. But since Oslo, Israel has not been paying those costs. The international donors have been paying them instead. DFID and the USAID and the EU and European governments have been paying for those schools and those roads, which lets Israel off the hook. It gives them a lot more free money to do other things like continue the occupation. Not only that, but when Israel turns around and bombs those same roads and schools that have been funded by the international donors, they don't pay the bill for the damage they've caused. The international donors come back and rebuild the roads and the schools again. So what we have here is a situation where aid is subsidizing the Israeli occupation directly and letting it be a free, no-cost obligation or no-cost experience for Israel. And that's what's maintaining the occupation. The kind of international aid in terms of help that Palestine needs is for international actors to intervene politically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, stop protecting Israel from the economic, political, and cultural consequences of the occupation. Because I'm sure that if Israel bore the full cost of the occupation, it would end within hours. Within hours, it would end, and Palestinians could develop naturally with a natural economic and cultural and social growth.
Okay, to be fair, we don't have a response from Israel at the moment, but I think we would look to get one at some stage. But I guess, Alan Duncan, I should come back to you for a quick answer to what Nora had to say there. I mean, from what I heard her say there, she said the money is working, but it's your money that's going directly into programs and that Israel's kind of off the hook here. How do you respond to that?
I think she's confusing two issues here. One is the effectiveness of aid as a development force, and the other is the interrelationship between the Palestinian economy and the Israeli occupation. Well, I think she needs to disentangle those two things. But what I think her view illustrates is the fact that Palestine is a unique political challenge as well as an economic one. But if she's saying that we should withdraw and pull the rug from underneath the Palestinian economy, I would not agree with that, because I think that would increase the risk of conflict. And one of our objectives in development is to try and address states that are fragile or at risk of conflict or having just gone through conflict, to try and stabilize the situation and give them a better future. So I think that pulling the rug from under the Palestinian economy would be very unwise. What we would far rather see is the development of proper talks and a two-state solution in which a viable Palestine can live alongside a secure Israel, and we can see an end to the sort of tensions that Noor has just been describing.
We could, I fear, actually talk about Israel and Palestine for the rest of this discussion, so I'm conscious of moving things along. Also want to get back to Will again, who is in Kenya. And in fact, we will look now at the money that is being spent on Kenya donor funding. This is DFID again. That spent $108 million in assistance to Kenya in 2010-2011, and then total foreign donations to Kenya in 2010, that was $1.6 billion. Yet again, according to the latest World Bank statistics, 45.9% of Kenyans are still at the poverty line. So, Will, those numbers don't read very nice. And then there was that number which you brought up before, and I still think it's great talking about, you know, the amount of aid that was needed in Kenya. Yes, it was for a drought assistance, but the amount of money going out all of time. Was it $3 billion worth of food going out? That's got to be government responsibility to sort out that balance.
Yeah, Kamal, the situation's a bit ridiculous. We've got aid coming in, and it's basically treating Kenya like a patchwork. Once in a while it comes and fixes a solution here or there, and essentially there's no accountability, there's no government relation with that aid, and also, Alan's right in the sense that aid and development aren't necessarily linked together, and we need programs that are thinking out of this aid box, because the aid problem of creating dependent nations on aid it's horrible. I mean, in Kenya, the dependence on antiretroviral drugs for HIV now is ubiquitous. Everyone that has HIV in the country right now is incredibly dependent on these drugs. Yet there was no push from aid organizations to locally develop these drugs. And so essentially we're addicted to donor funding in many different ways in the country, and it stifles all sorts of growth. So again, moving towards solutions that involve local currencies where we can actually create networks that self-support each other and where the local people can do their own aid. I mean, really, that's what we need in Kenya and throughout East Africa. We need the local population empowered to do their own aid their own development and incubate their own businesses.
One side of this argument we haven't heard from directly, as it were, is the actual aid agencies themselves. Now, we couldn't get one on the program, but I did manage to speak to Emma Seary from Oxfam just a little bit earlier. Again, all three of you and our viewers, just have a listen to what she said when I asked about their aid model.
Our model is not an aid model per se. We also look at the kind of structural causes of poverty and what kind of policy and practices rich countries, institutions, and of course developing country governments, what do they need to change to really solve these problems? And that's really where this call for an end to extreme wealth and an end to extreme inequality comes from.
So, Will, in Nairobi, just quickly, the first thing Emma from Oxfam said there was we're not aid, we're development, and that's kind of what Alan said very early on in this discussion. Do you think the organisations themselves like that can really separate themselves? Because if there's an acute issue, they have to jump in, and it is aid. It is aid when they have to jump in like that.
Well, there's a big difference between what's called emergency aid and this sort of chronic aid that's constantly be given to countries year after year after year. And a lot of development organizations say that they're giving emergency aid, when in fact they give that same emergency aid every single year and nothing actually changes. Again, when we talk about development, we have to say, where are we developing towards? And does the West actually, or do developed nations have a model even right now? Essentially, the model that the West is promoting of rampant capitalism has essentially failed. It's destroying the entire planet as we speak. And so I'd really like to hear from these aid organizations what models they're proposing. Here at the Institute, we're really trying to push these ideas that we need an incredibly new monetary system completely, because the monetary system itself is actually one of the problems in this entire system. It's sort of one of the root causes of this sort of financial corruption. If we have an exponential rise in debt in the world and interest being collected on that debt, essentially we have this insatiable demand to put more and more people into debt in the world. And that's what we see happening all over the world. And it's essentially creating huge amounts of social stratification. So as Kenya launches into this type of development, we're seeing the same types of problems. We're seeing very rich Kenyans and very more poor Kenyans. It's the same, we're copying the same model that the Americans are trying to promote. And it's not healthy there, and it's not healthy here either. OK, Nora and Alan, we are starting to run down the clock, so a quick final word from the both of you. First of all, Nora, I know, again, we've got a very unique situation in Palestine. Short of ending the occupation, do you think the types of ideas that Will has talked about could actually start making a difference in your part of the world?
Absolutely, because I've worked with Dahlia Association, a local Palestinian NGO, along with the global movement of civil society, to redefine development. So we push against the donors' attempts to define it as economic growth and focus more on human rights. And that's why I say that in Palestine, development, which is realization of Palestinian rights to self-determination and to self-determination in development, means that the decisions over whether a school or a road is going to be built should not be taking place in Tel Aviv, but also should not be taking place in Washington or Brussels or Tokyo. Palestinians need to make their own decisions about their own development and to control those development resources.
Alan Duncan, I'll leave the final word to you. In fact, the first word with you was that you said no, development works, and you had the proof. As you hear from Jerusalem and Nairobi there, do you remain as convinced? Do you understand where they're coming from?
Yes, but it's also the last NGO comment. I mean, calling for an end to extreme wealth is a pretty facile way of looking at what is necessary in development. An end to corruption and theft, yes. Good markets that are working, yes. A good regime in which people have property rights, security and freedom so that they can build up an economic livelihood, yes. It's that kind of thing that we're concentrating on in development, and it's why the private sector matters so much, and it's why we don't deal directly with governments we do not trust. It's the actual economy of real people in a country which is the engine of development we want to encourage.
Alan Duncan in London, Nora Murad in Jerusalem and Will Ruddock in Nairobi. I'd like to thank all three of you for taking the time to join us on Counting the Cost today. And that is our show for this week. Just a special mention, though, to Camilla Green, our producer, who brought this show together this week. Her Twitter details are on screen now if you'd like to get in touch with her. As are my Twitter details. Here they come, at Kamal AJE. Also, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. And if you're not the @ type, the tweeting type, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. And then there is our website, aljazeera.com/business. That is where you'll find the latest business headlines and a link to the Counting the Cost page where you can watch this or any of our previous episodes again. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.